Okay, we're ready to start church history in preparation for Easter 2020. Sorry we couldn't meet in person under the circumstances. You all know why. So we're going to videotape something tonight and then try to do a second segment later to get this all in before Easter. So the goal really of my presentation is to not just have us learn about church history, but to also serve as a review of what all of you have learned throughout the year in class and to try to tie it all together. And not only that, but to understand not just the current state of the church, but really more of the current state of the world. If some of you are like me, at one time before I came back into the church, I would ask, well, why is the world the way it is? How did we get the way it is? Has it always been this way? Those kind of questions. So hopefully, if you have those kind of questions, they'll be answered this week and next. Probably especially next, but we gotta get there first. So the first thing we will start with is a person called Alexander the Great, who lived from 356 to 323 BC. And by the way, I have my little historical timeline here. Probably some of you will get a copy of this as well as one that Kathy has made to help follow along. Okay, so if you get this as an attachment, you might want to print it out first along with Kathy's and we can follow along, okay? So, Alexander the Great conquers the Persian Empire. He spreads what's called Hellenistic culture. For those of you who have seen the word before, it's in Scripture many times. If you see the word Hellenistic, it just means Greek stuff. I'll just make it simple. Just think of Greek stuff, okay? So he spreads Hellenistic or Greek culture, okay? Throughout Greece, Macedonia, these are the names of these countries today. Greece, Macedonia, Albania, Serbia, Bulgaria, Turkey, Egypt, Jordan, Israel, Syria, Iran, Iraq, Armenia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. Many historians say that this was the greatest earthly achievement in history. He even founded his own city named Alexandria. And he died at just about the same age as Jesus. They have him dying at 34 or a late 33, same age as Jesus. Interesting if you compare the two, because the other person you would say might be the most successful in Western history is Jesus Christ. They both lived to be 33. But one got there by spilling everyone else's blood, and one got there by spilling his own. I think it's an interesting compare and contrast for us as Catholic Christians right off the bat about how to live our lives if you compare these two people. Now, what's important about Alexander the Great and his accomplishments through war? Well, like I said, he spread Hellenistic culture, and more specifically, Greek thinkers, Hellenistic thinking. So, it kind of goes in this order of the most famous. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And by the way, Aristotle is who taught Alexander. Plato taught Aristotle, Socrates taught Plato. Now, we've got to set a ground rule real quick because all of you've learned a lot during the year, and hopefully you're going to learn a lot more after watching a couple videos, right? And you're all excited about your faith, and that's really good, and you're more confident, and that's really good, and you want to share your faith, and we love that, and that's really good. However, if you start explaining your faith and how Catholicism, and we'll talk about this in a second, is a synthesis of Greek and Latin and Hebrew, and you start talking about these Greek thinkers, and you pronounce his name Socrates, his name is Socrates, not Socrates. If you pronounce it Socrates, do not tell them you took RCA at St. Barnabas. Tell them you took it at St. Jude. Ground rule, okay? All right, so anyway, primarily the two thinkers that have affected our church are Plato and Aristotle. We will get to his, let's see if I got a place. Yeah, let's talk about Plato real quick. Actually, let's wait till later. All right, second, Rome. All right, once Alexander dies, the next great power is Rome. Okay, and Rome included most of Alexander's empire plus most of Europe and North Africa. They adopt Hellenistic culture, but they add Roman organization and engineering genius. Okay, so what we're doing here is Greek thought is this blue line. Roman order is this red line. Okay, so they're taking over. They inherit the Hellenistic culture. All right, but think about the great aqueducts, colosseums. Think of all the great engineering feats that the Romans were able to do. And for the longest time, even after Rome eventually falls, which we'll talk about, people still couldn't understand how they did those things. Okay, they were really the first civilization to have running water, for example. Okay, third, Israel. Now, Israel has two primary groups, the Pharisees, and Jesus was a Pharisee, and we'll say they have the fullness of revelation, okay? They accepted all of what we know today as the Old Testament. However, they did not like Greek stuff or Hellenistic stuff. So the Pharisaic Jews that lived in Israel did not like Greek stuff. They thought it was impure, okay? Then there's the Sadducees. They had limited revelation because they only accept the first 5 books of the Old Testament that we call the Pentateuch. However, they were pro-Hellenist. They liked the Greek stuff. Now this will come into play in just a few minutes, okay? Now those Jews that were part of the dispersion, those that were outside of Israel, were all Hellenists. You had to be, because the universal language at the time was Greek. Everyone understood Greek. By the way, there was a third group we found out about later called the Essenes, where we get the Dead Sea Scrolls. They also lived at this time, but they were kind of almost like a monastic community out on their own. Okay, so our church began in figure at the very beginning and continued through the Israelites. That's from Vatican II's, we'll talk about Vatican II later. It's a church statement. Already present in figure at the beginning of the world, the church was prepared in marvelous fashion by the people of Israel. The Jews are our fathers in faith. Okay, this is where we inherit our salvation history. Now, you had this a little earlier, but just to remind you, I'll throw a little Scott Hahn in here for you. I know a lot of you like Scott Hahn. It's the salvation history and covenant theology through the Jews. Adam and Eve. Okay, that was a covenant of both marriage and personal. Noah was a family covenant. Abraham, God made a tribal covenant with Abraham. Moses made a national covenant. David was a kingship covenant. Jesus is the international or Catholic or universal covenant. Jesus is born at the crossroads of these 3 cultures: Greek, Latin, Hebrew. The way to remember this is above his head on the cross. Good Friday coming up soon. Remember the inscription that was put above his head. This is Jesus, King of the Jews. What were the 3 languages used? Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. Our church still today is the only place where these 3 things are still held together. We will see a break-off in the second segment. We'll see these things start to split. Right here, these things are held together. We call it synthesis, where we keep them together. All right? All right, next is the start of the church. Pentecost. Interestingly enough, we don't have an exact date, but we know it within about 4 years. All right, so it's sometime 28 to 32 AD. Then we have the conversion of Paul. Lived approximately from 5 through 67. Okay, why is Paul so important? Number one, Paul is a Pharisee. Now remember what I said earlier, that a Pharisee accepts all of the Old Testament that we have today. Back then they accepted the entire book. Okay, so they were more, if you will, synthetic. Okay, they were less I'll think of a word here in a minute. They had Paul is from Turkey, which is part of the dispersion. So again, Paul is a Pharisee, and he understands Greek well. He's part of the Greek culture, okay? Just one problem. Paul was very anti-Christian. We see it in Scripture where Paul was persecuting the Jews, okay? However, probably the most well-known conversion story ever, Paul's on the horse on the way to Damascus, and he's knocked off the horse and he's blinded, and the voice of Jesus said, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And he said, "Who are you that I'm persecuting?" And he said, I'm Jesus. I'm the one you're persecuting. So Paul converts being a Christian. So he's a Pharisee who is well-read in Greek, and now he becomes Christian. So the one big hurdle that he had, obviously, is anti-Christianity. God helps him overcome it. So Paul actually becomes the most synthesized of all the apostles. He has more truth in his being and in his thinking than all the rest of the apostles. So what happens? Paul is the one that is able to convert the Gentiles. The other apostles are Jewish from Jerusalem. They don't understand the Greek stuff. They don't understand the Gentiles as well as Paul does. Okay? Paul becomes the greatest evangelizer of all time, and he even wins. This is a really interesting story in early church history, and it's in Acts of the Apostles. The first council is the Council of Jerusalem in AD 49. And it's Paul and Peter who are having a disagreement about circumcision and a couple other things. And Peter's demanding that Christians adhere to the Jewish law about circumcision. And Paul is basically telling them, no, that has nothing to do with them understanding Jesus, better or worse, just because they're circumcised or uncircumcised. That law should not apply to these new Christians who don't even understand what Judaism is. And just as all councils, bishops, cardinals get together and they kind of hammer it out and compromise, or there's one winner and a loser. Well, surprisingly, remember, Peter's the first pope, but Paul wins this. Okay? And so new Christians do not have to be circumcised, and a couple other rules about dietary things and so forth are lessened for the new Christians. Okay? So This shows Paul adopting the gospel to new situations without watering it down. Very important. Okay? That's the Catholic way. We adopt things as through time, but we do not water down the gospel. Okay? It's simply adjusting to a new circumstance. Okay? And this is what I mean by synthesis. Okay? Taking all the elements of truth and putting it together to make one big truth. Okay? So, what about the early Christians in the Roman Empire? At first, mostly, the Christians were considered part of the Jewish faith. The Jews were legally allowed to practice their faith, and soon, though, it was obvious that Christians were not Jews. Christians soon became bothersome to the Roman order. To understand Rome, if I had to put it in one sentence, it would be this: we have an empire to run. It's pretty much as simple as that. If you bother the empire, they're going to bother you. If you let the empire run, they're not going to bother you. So the Christians were perceived to be bothering the empire, okay? And in some ways they were, because they were not sacrificing to the gods, you see. And to sacrifice to the gods, you had to buy things, and so the economy suffered a little bit. Okay, because their one true sacrifice had already happened. Sacrifice is Jesus himself. So they were simply getting together for the breaking of the bread, for the Mass. Okay? So, some Roman emperors like Nero and Diocletian were very aggressive towards the Christians, and others were less so. Martyrdom became very important. A quote from Tertullian, an early church father, who actually died a little outside the church, but we won't worry about little things. Tertullian said, "The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church." An interesting letter from history we still have from this time. There is a correspondence between the Emperor Trajan and Pliny the Younger. And in this, Pliny's writing the emperor saying, what am I going to do about these Christians? And Trajan said, do just enough to keep the order, to run the empire smoothly, like I said earlier. Again, even most Romans, by the way, didn't believe in the Roman gods. All right? These Roman gods were used to keep order. The real God at the time, if you want to understand it, was Rome. Everything was for the empire. Do it for the empire. Rome's the real God here. All right, so what we know from this letter, too, it shows us that Christians were growing rapidly at the time, and the economy was being affected. If they weren't growing very much, the economy wouldn't be affected, okay? But the economy was affected. So Christianity grew pretty quickly, even though it could cost you your life. There were other important documents in this early part of the church. The Didache, which is called the First Catechism, and the Shepherd of Hermas. Some actually wanted to include that one in Scripture. Okay, so next. Constantine, 272 to 337. Constantine was about to go to battle against a rival, and whoever would win this battle would then be the sole ruler of Rome. The rival is Maxentius, okay? And it was going to be settled at what is known as, and this is one of the most famous battles ever, and probably the most famous in Christian history. It's called the Battle of Milvian Bridge. exact date is 10/28/312. So before this battle, Constantine receives a vision. Now, he's married to a Christian, but he himself is not Christian. He receives a vision from what he calls the Christian God. And the vision says this: before you go into battle, you need to put this monogram on your shields. This should look familiar to some of you, if not all of you. Did I do that right? Okay. All right. This is called the Chi-Rho, or as my history professor pronounced it, Chi-Rho. It means Christ. So Constantine has all his soldiers put this monogram on their shields. Now, they were big underdogs in this battle. Nevertheless, after this vision and after putting this on their shields, they are victorious. All right? So Constantine becomes the sole ruler of Rome. So for the first time, there's the Edict of Milan in 313, which gives religious toleration. And then shortly thereafter, about 10 years, Christianity becomes the official religion, approximately 323. Constantine then founds his own city. This is kind of common, you want to name a city after yourself, I guess. So he founds Constantinople, which is now known as Istanbul, in 324. Basically, back then, the hot area of the world was in the east. So after Constantine unites Rome, Rome wasn't the cool place to be. Constantinople was. Okay, so, which again is in modern day Turkey. So that's where he goes, and that's where really the hub of Rome starts to take shape. Okay. Changing gears a little bit, let's talk about the Bible a bit. Now, we've had a class on this. Some of this will be review. I'll just probably state things in a little bit different way. But anyway, what the heck is the Bible? Where did we get it? Okay, well, the Bible developed is basically a collection of writings, and the church had to decide which one of these are inspired and which ones are not. Okay? So 3 basic criteria. I think in the Formed series, I think they use 4 criteria. I make it simpler and use 3. Okay? So the 3 criteria are authorship, doctrine, and liturgical use. Who wrote it? What does it say? And is it being used in the liturgy, at least in a large area of the church at the time? We have the Old Testament at Christ during the time of Christ was in Greek. Remember, Greek's the universal language. That's called the Septuagint. Okay, and we've always used that Greek version of the Old Testament. As far as the oldest New Testament that we've found is called the Muratorian Fragment, and it was around AD 200. And it was in the Latin New Testament. Okay, so it was in Latin. It included commentary and a rejection of heretical canon. Heretical basically means untruthful things that do not accurately describe Christ or his church. Okay. We have much commentary from people like Irenaeus and Origen about the New Testament. They had a large their commentary was used in a lot of determining what was included as the canon and what's not. The first version of the exact Old Testament and New Testament we have today was used, Athanasius used, Bishop of Alexandria, in 367. So you would say the first Bible that we use today was from 367. That's the first time it was all put together and used. Okay, then there was an African Synod in 393, again applying the New Testament and the Septuagint. Then it was repeated in two councils in Carthage in 397 and 419. And then St. Jerome, he translated the entire Bible into Latin, known as the Latin Vulgate, in 383. It was a masterpiece work. Can't imagine the hours he spent doing that. So one thing to keep in mind here, the Bible wasn't written for decades after Christ died. It wasn't put together. Again, the first Bible was put together in 367. And it wasn't able to be widely used by the church until 400, 500, when we could distribute all these things and people could, and even then, the lay people couldn't read, okay? It was just the educated that could read. So the point here is, if you look at our modern day Christian churches, especially those that say they are Bible-based, to them, it all starts with the Bible. But for Catholics, at least Catholics who understand church history, the church started at Pentecost. The Bible came much later. The Bible is simply the truth that was already there in written form, okay? But the verbal tradition and the written tradition all come from the same place. Catholics also don't say that all truth is compared in the Bible. That's not the point of it. The point of it is to guide us all towards salvation, okay? And the Bible is very highly elevated by the church. As a matter of fact, it's church teaching that the church cannot teach anything that's opposed to the Bible. But the church also doesn't say that all truth was in the Bible. There are a lot of reasons for that. I mean, we can talk about science and reason, all right, and we can talk about other things that may come up in life that at the time the Bible was written couldn't have possibly been talked about, okay? So just want you to understand the Bible's place in the church, that those of you that have a Protestant background, that's a huge difference for you. And as you talk to friends who are of other Christian denominations, that's going to be a big difference there. So pray about that and ponder about that, about how that's different. And remember, win an argument, lose a convert. Don't argue about it. Just explain what the church believes and why, and let the Holy Spirit do His work. Okay? All right, next. This guy is a giant. Any theologian will this is one of the main guys ever, okay? It is Saint Augustine. (354 to 430). All right, St. Augustine. One of the most interesting people in church history, maybe the most, I don't know. St. Augustine is from North Africa. North Africa is a very Greek and vibrant Christian area. His father was a Roman pagan. His mother, very famous saint. She was Christian, and her name was Saint Monica. So he had a Christian upbringing, but he abandoned the faith. He took a mistress for 10 years, and they have a child out of wedlock. Okay? St. Augustine was a Manichaeist. Now, what the heck does that mean? A Manichaeist simply means that they believe that there's equal power of good and evil. All right? Spirit good, body evil. Spirit good, body evil, but one's not more powerful than the other. I almost think of Star Wars when I say that, all right? But there's like this good and evil power. It's impersonal, so it's not like a godly thing. It's just this power of good versus evil. Spirit is good, body is evil. But there are three things that led to Augustine's conversion. Number one, he started reading Plato. So now we do a little mini philosophy lesson. Why would Plato matter to Augustine? Okay. Plato's thinking, now, Plato's writings and books written about Plato are less, I'm simplifying this big time, okay? But Plato's basic thinking is this. Plato's a very religious man who believes in God. He believes that all people at one time were in heaven, and that we lose all of our knowledge about God in heaven during the birthing process. So now we're on the earth, and life is all about relearning that process. So knowledge is a huge thing with Plato. You are being perfected as you gain knowledge through your life. That's the goal. More specifically, when we're looking at things around us, Plato believed that everything we see, including our own bodies, are phantoms. They're not real. So, this body, that chalkboard, that camera, that floor, this table, this crucifix, everything's a phantom. It's a reflection of the truth which is in heaven. Okay? There's your Plato .0001 philosophy course, okay? So, remember, St. Augustine's a Manichaeist. Spirit good, body evil. He reads Plato. Plato has body not real, phantom, right? Material not real. All of it's phantom. It's all just a reflection of what's real, heaven, okay? So he starts reading Plato, and his mind starts to convert. Then he hears the preaching of St. Ambrose, the Bishop of Milan. St. Ambrose was a great preacher, and St. Augustine, one of the smartest people that's ever walked the earth. He's a genius, right? So he hears the great preaching, and all of a sudden his heart, after Plato changes his mind, now his heart starts to change. Then, of course, just as important as the other two, the influence of his own mother. St. Monica never, ever wavered. She always prayed for her son to come back to the church. Okay? St. Monica's prayers were affecting his spirit. Okay? So, mind, heart, spirit. All right? And he converts. St. Monica, by the way, is the patroness of married women and obviously a model for Christian mothers. So what does St. Augustine do? The great thing that he does is, again, a genius, okay? He synthesizes Plato and Christianity. So he takes everything he reads about Plato and everything he learns about Christianity, and all his writings have these where they merge. Okay, again, I use the word, he synthesizes it. All right, but he puts them together and comes out with one great product, one great way of thinking as a Christian. Okay? So, Augustine's writings were the main thinking of the church. All right, people would go to his writings, all right, up until we have another man, all right, later on in the Middle Ages that we'll talk about in the second class, okay? So he was considered at the time the greatest thinker in church history up until another guy we'll talk about later, okay? One thing to remember, I always try to say this about trying to remember this whole Augustine and Plato kind of relationship, and I realize that those of you that are younger don't speak like this anymore, but back in my day, let's just say that you had especially if it was a guy and a girl and they had a friendship, and it was a friendship, but their friends would ask them if they were dating, and they would say, oh no, we're totally on a platonic level, or we have a platonic relationship. That word comes from Plato, because there's no senses, no touching, it's all just spiritual based on a friendship level, right? You're just talking to one another. That's where that word comes from. It might help you remember it, okay? That's the reason why I bring that up. Okay, so Augustine agreed, reluctantly, in his writings, that the body must be good, but if you read his writings, he kind of just ignores the body. And you can see this, and again, I hate to criticize Augustine in any way, because again, he's such a giant in church history and church thinking. But there were a couple of things that later on had to be cleaned up by the next great thinker, okay? And one was Augustine's views on sexual intercourse, for example. He did not think that a married man and a woman could have sexual intercourse and not sin while doing it. So in his thinking, celibacy was far and away a holier calling. Okay? He also had a view about predestination, which the church rejected. Predestination means from the very time you're born, you're either going to heaven or hell, and you can't do anything about it. There are other Christian religions that actually still believe that. But the church rejected that right off the bat. But we get a hint of his real thoughts on the human person, and they're a little bit imperfect. Let's just put it that way, okay? Again, I hate to criticize him because he was so amazing, okay? He's considered the second greatest mind in the history of the church. Again, we'll talk about the first greatest later. His best-known works are City of God. I should have brought a copy of it because I have one. It's modeled after Plato's Republic. Confessions, which was kind of an interior work where he was talking about his own spiritual journey. And also a great work on the Trinity. I mean, I've got that one too. It's a big sucker, okay? A lot of things he had to say about the Trinity. However, he rejects, after all this, he rejects Aristotle. He actually reads Aristotle and thinks Aristotle's far too pagan. Aristotle did not believe in God per se, or let's just say he wasn't a religious man, let's put it that way. So Aristotle becomes lost to the Western world until later on in the Middle Ages. Later on, Aristotle will play a big role through another person, but we'll talk about that later. Okay. Councils, I'll just go through these real quick. What are the importance of church councils? We talked about the first one, the Council of Jerusalem in 49. Councils are always called if there is a major issue going on in the church, okay? Usually there's some type of false teaching going on. The only example that I can think of that that's not the case, which makes it unique, was the very last council we've had in the 60s, which was Vatican II. That council was a little different. All the councils prior, there was something going on, some heresy, some teaching going on and people are adopting it and the church needs to get together and say, we need to talk about this and fix this, okay? That's the purpose of a council, really, okay? It helps us develop the true teaching, orthodox teaching in Catholicism. Okay, so here are some examples. We'll just go through these quickly. I don't want to go too far in depth. Council of Nicaea in 325. That condemned Arianism. What was Arianism? Arians claimed that Jesus was not God. Okay? So because they get together, they have the council, that helps them define the incarnation. That yes, Jesus actually is God. Okay? And that's where the Nicene Creed that we say at Mass, that's where the creed started. Okay? At that council. It was finished later at Constantinople. Then there was a council at Chalcedon in 451. That council got together and condemned Docetism. What's Docetism? Well, the Docetists believed that Jesus really wasn't human. Well, Catholic teaching, Jesus was fully God and fully man, right? Fully divine, fully human. Okay? They also condemned Nestorianism. What was Nestorianism? Well, they believed that Jesus had only one nature. No. If Jesus is fully God and fully human, he has two natures, a God nature and a human nature. Okay? Then it goes on. There's a council of second and third councils of Constantinople. Further expanded on Chalcedon that Jesus is one person with two natures, called the hypostasis. One person, but because he's fully God and fully human, two natures, right? God nature, human nature. We call that hypostasis. So Jesus not only has two natures, but two wills, a godly will and a human will. No other major changes until Vatican II. All councils are called because they were dealing with some kind of heresy, as we talked about before. There were a lot of church fathers, we call them, that contributed to the thinking and the scriptural canon and the church organization. Pope St. Clement, Justin Martyr, Gregory Nazianzen, John Chrysostom, Athanasius, Ambrose, Jerome, Cyprian, and Augustine. There were two that contributed a lot, but actually died heretics, Tertullian and Origen. The reason why I mention all of these people, and without exception, even the two that died heretics, all of these people have something in common that we rarely see today. All of them were holy geniuses. Now, I told you one of the things I want to get through is that how our world is what it is today. How did we get here? Today, when we think of geniuses, just pick one. A scientific genius, Einstein, the founder of a great company, just pick one. We rarely call them holy geniuses because they aren't. But in the early church, you can see this synthesis of reason and thought and faith and holiness all combined in these people. Today we don't see it a lot. We recognize it when we see it. We'll talk about a certain pope that I certainly think had it. But today, you'll see it in the saints today. I think you could see it in Mother Teresa, right? But you just don't see it like you did back then. Just a thought, just something to think about there. Okay. Next. The barbarian invasions. All right, so this is from 400 to 600. So, right after St. Augustine gets done with all his writings and he passes on, Rome was in for a treat. Okay, there were these Germanic tribes searching for land, and they were living outside the Roman Empire. So the Romans knew them. As a matter of fact, many of the Romans would hire them as mercenaries. And these German tribes really had deep respect for Rome. They wanted in, but they weren't allowed in. But then something changed, okay? There was another tribe that was non-Germanic that came on the scene and forced the floodgates open, okay? And so let's just name the German tribes first. So the Germanic tribes, here are examples. You might be able to tell by the names where some of these eventually settled. The Franks, the Visigoths, the Saxons, the Lombards, the Vandals. Okay, those are most of the German tribes. And then the tribe that wasn't German, the Huns. Okay, so what's happening here? You have all these German tribes. These are people that are kind of a little bit of larger stature, a lot of blonde hair and blue eyes. They're Germanic. And then neither Roman nor Germanic tribes had ever seen people like the Huns before. The Huns come flying in. I mean that almost literally, because they were great horsemen. They were super fast on their horses. And they had what's called the Hun bow. So they could be on their horse, pulling these arrows out, and the Hun bow was an extremely small and light bow that had way more power and torque than normal bow, and they could come in and annihilate any other tribe in no time flat. People were scared to death of the Huns. All the Germanic tribes, the Romans, everyone was scared to death of the Huns. Their most famous leader, by the way, a guy named Attila the Hun. Probably heard his name before. Okay, so when the Huns show up, these German tribes have a decision to make. Do we want to stay here and face the Huns, or are we going to get out of Dodge and go into Rome and take our chances? Well, they decided to go into Rome and take their chances, okay? So in very short order, Rome falls. Rome had gotten too big, too fast. And the other thing that historians, I think, won't mention, there were a lot of Christians in Rome, and Christians didn't believe that Rome was the God anymore. To Christians, Jesus is their God. So this whole idea of let's do everything for the empire and everything for Rome, to Christians, that wasn't going to make a lot of sense. Those that were not living a Christian life, Rome was also, those that weren't Christians were also living a very decadent life, and they weren't really, let's just say they got lazy, okay? So anyway, they were ripe for the picking, and the German tribes came in, and the Western Empire falls by 476. There's basically no order, but there's still respect for Rome, and by the way, this is what you would call the true Dark Ages. Some Protestant theologians especially will call the Dark Ages from this time all the way until Martin Luther in the 1500s, okay? No. But this really is the Dark Ages. There's no order. All the Roman culture is just lost quickly. So Western civilization and the Catholic Church eventually were saved, however. How and by whom? Well, they were saved primarily from two things. The monasteries and Pope St. Gregory the Great. Okay. Well, so let's first talk about the monasteries. The interesting thing about all this, not only talking about Rome's expansion, but then this barbarian invasion and the fall of Rome, none of this affected Ireland. And by Ireland, at this time, I'm not just talking about the island itself. I'm also talking about Wales, or at least Western Wales, and southwestern Scotland. That whole area was a Celtic or a Celtic. They had their own culture, their own languages, their own type of trade. Very different culture from the rest, and they were untouched. Rome never made it to Ireland. They didn't think it was worth it to go there. They didn't know what they were missing. So anyway, the Irish monks preserved Christianity and culture because remember, St. Patrick had already converted to Ireland. Okay, so Ireland was a Christian culture. Okay. If you want to see the most beautiful Bible, I think, ever made, look up what's called the Book of Kells, Kells. The Irish monks, the writing, all right, is magnificent, but then they also draw these magnificent pictures throughout the Bible. It's just beautiful art, okay? So look that up, Book of Kells, okay? Anyway, they're sitting in this kind of Celtic wonderland here, untouched, and then, you know, hey, they hear that Rome's fallen. So they begin to re-Christianize Europe. But there's a culture barrier, all right? Celtic culture is different than Germanic culture. And though they got a good start, they didn't get that far. If you go to Ireland today, you can see I've been there 3 times. If you, and especially the first time I went back in the 80s, the Irish have a nice, beautiful disorganization about them. So in other words, you can be driving down the road, and one business could have a gas pump, selling cheese, selling coffee, selling Guinness, and tables and chairs. So it's a, and again, I don't know if it's still, I haven't been there in a while, but it's awesome. Okay. But the Germanic people are again, they were more like the Romans. They're organized. Right? You go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. Okay. They're less like this and more linear like this. Okay. So what happens? We have the start of the Benedictine monasteries. Saint Benedict, from 480 to 547, Saint Benedict grew up just outside of Rome. And so he's Italian, and he's very Roman, and he's very organized, and he sees what the Irish has started, and so he picks up where they left off. And he establishes the monastery at Monte Cassino in 520, and he taught the values of agricultural living, he taught organization and culture, and he taught Jesus Christ. So now these Germanic cultures start to become well Christianized. I want to talk a little bit about one thing that's lost even with Catholic historians. I think this is really sad, and I think here in America especially we don't really get it. Now, I got my theology degree from St. Meinrad, and if you haven't been there, you need to go, because you feel like you are walking back in time. You don't feel like you're in Indiana, for sure. And you really don't feel like you're living in 2020 either. It's an interesting journey if you go there. But you get maybe a little feel about what I'm about to tell you. But I want you to understand for a second that what we call today Europe was completely, I mean, they had just lost everything. And everything then began to happen at these monasteries. Everything began to happen at the monasteries. Okay? So when I took a history class from one of the professors at St. Meinrad, this class was actually taught in Indianapolis, so there were only 2 students, which was kind of neat. He gave us an assignment, and basically we had to watch 2 videos of a show about a monastery called, from the Brother Cadfael series. Some of you there are, I'm 50, I'll soon be 56. Some of you are close to my age or older, might remember this. It was on TV. The Brother Cadfael series, okay? So we each watched 2 videos, And the assignment was, come back and tell me what you see back during this time. We're basically talking early Middle Ages now. About if you see today either a business or a job or something that grew out of those things that you see. Okay, so a total of 4 videos. Each of us had 2. So here's what we saw. Ready? Botanist, horticulturalist, zoologist, detective, pharmaceutical manufacturer, pharmacist, hospital, doctor, masseuse, judge, attorney, retirement community, life insurance company, executor of a will, a charity, landlord, convention center, hotel, funeral home, including embalming, dressing, casketing, and cosmetology, all communication, library, school, adoption home, art museum, church, and prayer. All that happened at the monastery. If you went anywhere else, you were out in farmland. Even farming happened at the monastery because they had their own garden right there. Okay, so everything happened at the monastery. So if you were traveling, you needed a place to stay, no Holiday Inns, folks. Monasteries, that's where you stayed. Okay, you want to go to the library, read a book. Okay, you want to leave a will for your children. Who held the will? The monastery. Who made sure the will was carried out? The monastery. Okay, you got sick. Who helped you get well? The monastery. Right? Everything happened at the monastery. Again, as 21st century Americans, 99.999% of us don't get it. You get it now. Okay? Get a chance, go down to St. Meinrad. Okay? So, the learning centers of the medieval monasteries would eventually morph into the cathedral schools of the towns and cities, which eventually turned into the university that we know today. The Catholic Church and its monasteries were directly responsible for the modern university and the modern hospital. So, if any of you have ever been to the hospital, or know anyone that's been to the hospital, right? Or if you've been to the university, know anyone that's been to a university, they can thank the Catholic Church, whether they know it or not. Okay? Just letting you know. All right. Now, what else? What else brought us out of the Dark Ages? Pope St. Gregory the Great. I'm running over, but I don't know how much. What time do we get started?
6:30.
No? Okay. Thank you, cameraman. Okay. Pope St. Gregory the Great. Uh, 540 to 604. Okay. Why was he so important? All right, well, he was elected Pope in 590. He restored church discipline. You'll find throughout history the church has to do that once in a while. Things get lax. They call, they either it's part of the council or the Pope himself just says, hey, we need to restore church discipline, and it happens, okay? Removed unworthy clerics from office, abolished clerical fees for burials and ordinations, and he was known as being very charitable. He would bow to others instead of expecting them to bow to him. He protected the Jews from injustice. He persuaded the invading Lombards from invading Rome and made peace with their king, which prevented more intrusion from the Eastern Church. We'll talk about that later. He is primarily responsible for the conversion of England. He was a great preacher. He gave us Gregorian chant. We're doing a lot more chanting at Mass now. Guess where that came from? It's called Gregorian chant. Gregory the Great. He's primarily responsible for the rebuilding of Rome and the increased power of the Church and the Pope. Gregory is considered the founder of the medieval papacy and one of, if not the, greatest popes of all time. This next line that I'm going to say to you, I don't know if I've ever read a one-liner more beautiful than this one. I think you've heard it, okay? And all the popes say this now, and they got it from him. He called himself the servant of the servants of God. Beautiful line. Okay. Just a bit longer and we'll be there. Carolingian Empire. We'll say 800 to 888. All right, so many of you, maybe most of you, have heard of King Charlemagne. Okay, Charlemagne was a warrior who defeated the Muslims who were trying to get, this time Islam had gotten over to Spain, and they had pushed a lot of the Spaniards who were still trying to fight them up into the mountains in northern Spain. So then they tried to get into France. Well, this Carolingian Empire, King Charlemagne, his empire basically is modern day France, Germany, and northern Italy. You think about the outbreak where the whole corona thing's going on right now, that's northern Italy, that's his empire right there. Okay, so he defeats the Muslims and he's crowned at the Christmas Mass at 800 by Pope Leo III. Okay, so this was the first taste of modern Europe right here, this Carolingian Empire, King Charlemagne. By the way, my DNA test, through my DNA test, I am a descendant of King Charlemagne. So, but anyway, King Charlemagne restored Latin and Greek, trying to get back to, the classics, the Roman and Greek, all right? And you can see the building up of culture. And so you really have a start of modern Europe here, but then one thing unfortunately just happens. We're not done with the barbarian invasions yet. Because there's one last group that comes in 888, and I mean, these guys destroyed everything, and these were the Vikings. They came all the way in their purple jerseys from Minneapolis. No. Anyway, these were Nordic Vikings, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, that area. And anyway, they just wreaked all kind of havoc, and of course their main target, where did everything happen? The monasteries. So they would just hunt these monasteries down and take all the loot. That's what it was all about. It was like a hunting season for them. Okay, a certain time of year they would always just show up and just start killing people and taking their stuff. The amazing thing about the Vikings is that they were the great ship builders of the time. So they could build these ships with these bottoms where they could go into very shallow water. I mean, a shallow river. They could put I don't know how many, but a lot of fighters on one great big ship and go up these little rivers. So no monastery. I mean, most of the monasteries were by some kind of water source. So none of them really were exempt. So anyway, they destroyed the Carolingian Empire, and then they also, by the way, these were the first barbarians to get to Ireland, and they really caused Ireland a problem, as well as Scotland and England, okay? So then we enter the age of Christendom. So starting next week, we're going to start with the age of Christendom. And this is basically 1,000 to 1,500. Just a little hint, first thing we'll talk about is the Crusades. Always fun. All right, so I guess that's it for the first taping here. Feel free to ask any questions to me, Joe, I'm sure Kathy or anyone, all right? And I hope you all are feeling well and happy, and hopefully we get through this soon, all right? Thank you very much.